Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive paradigm shift in psychodynamic formulation. The core idea here? Patients don't just sit there and list their symptoms. No, they actively demonstrate their internal psychic world to us, right in the room, through their real-time behavior.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the 4 core pillars of psychodynamic formulation: transference, countertransference, resistance, and repetition. Then, we're going to tie the whole shebang together with a master clinical vignette.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, transference dynamics.
So what actually is transference? It's not just a patient thinking, you kind of remind me of my dad. It's way deeper. By definition, it's the automatic reenactment of past relational patterns in the present day. Developmentally, this originates from early childhood attachments. The actual intrapsychic mechanism here is the nonverbal activation of deeply encoded procedural memory. How does this look clinically? Well, it manifests as completely inappropriate expectations of you, the clinician. Think of a patient who is irrationally terrified that you're constantly judging them. The clinical implication of all this is absolutely crucial. Transference gives us direct, unfiltered data on the patient's internal object relations.
And this image beautifully highlights the neurobiological why behind all this. Transference actually stems from subcortically processed emotional states that converge right here in the right orbitofrontal cortex. It literally bypasses conscious narrative memory. It's what we call implicit relational knowing. The patient isn't actively choosing to see you this way. Their neural networks are just automatically firing based on deeply ingrained expectations.
Now, looking at the different types of transference, we see some really distinct presentations. Positive transference is great. It forms the bedrock of trust and the therapeutic alliance. Negative transference, on the other hand, is marked by hostility and usually bubbles up from abusive internal objects. Then you have erotic transference. For a neurotic patient, this might emerge gradually and feel pretty embarrassing, but in patients with severe personality disorders, it can be intense, immediate, and demanding, what we call an eroticized transference. Now, when we look at idealizing and mirror transferences, it gets super interesting because we have competing theoretical lenses. Take Heinz Kohut. He viewed idealizing the therapist or seeking that mirroring validation as a completely normal developmental need, just a way to patch together a fragment itself. But Otto Kernberg, he looked at the exact same behavior and saw a defense mechanism. To Kernberg, idealization is a defense against underlying rage and envy, and mirroring is just the projection of a grandiose self. As clinicians, we really need to understand both angles.
Okay, moving on to our second pillar, countertransference as information.
Now we're flipping the script to the therapist's experience. Countertransference follows a very similar sequence. By definition, it's the therapist's own emotional response. It originates from a collision, really, the patient's projections crashing into the therapist's own history. The intrapsychic mechanism driving this is usually projective identification, where the patient basically exerts interpersonal pressure on you. Clinically, this manifests as subtle little enactments or suddenly feeling some really intense affect. Like, ever find yourself feeling just completely unusually bored in a session? That's it right there. And the clinical implication? Countertransference isn't a mistake. It's arguably your most vital diagnostic instrument.
It's fascinating to see how this concept has evolved over time. Under Freud's classical narrow definition, countertransference was basically just the therapist's own unresolved baggage. It was purely subjective, a blind spot, an obstacle you had to get rid of. But contemporary psychiatry has a much broader view. Yes, it includes that subjective piece, but it also embraces objective or induced countertransference. Donald Winnicott famously coined the term objective hate, which is a totally natural, expectable reaction to a patient who is being outrageously provocative. Your total emotional reaction is actually a joint creation between you and the patient, and it is essential clinical data.
So, how do we decode our own feelings in the room? Let's say you're feeling incredibly helpless. A borderline patient might be trapping you in coercive bondage with escalating suicide threats. Feeling angry? You're probably on the receiving end of an abusive internal object they're projecting onto you. What if you're just bored to tears? A highly obsessive-compulsive patient is probably using isolation of affect, keeping you at a massive emotional distance. Ever feel fiercely protective? You might be engaged in disidentification with the aggressor, desperately wanting to, quote, save the patient. We have to monitor these feelings, feeling incompetent, being idealized, feeling controlled, because recognizing them is the only thing that stops us from acting out. If we just react, the risks are massive. We might retaliate, set punitive limits, or just bask in a mutual admiration society with a narcissistic patient. We have to use the feeling to diagnose, never just to react.
Let's pivot to our third pillar, resistance as protection.
We've really got to unlearn this idea that a resistant patient is just being stubborn or bad. Resistance is, at its core, all about protection. Developmentally, it originates from the ego's desperate, fundamental need to maintain psychic equilibrium. The intrapsychic mechanism is the mobilization of defenses to block out overwhelming, painful affect, or frankly, to block the terrifying threat of change itself. For example, imagine an OCPD patient who just talks nonstop for the entire 50-minute session. They aren't just trying to annoy you. That is a brilliant clinical manifestation of resistance, protecting them from ever having to experience anger or dependency in the room. The implication here is a total mindset shift. Resistance itself is the focus of the treatment, not just an annoying hurdle to jump over.
Let's tease apart some technical distinctions here so we don't mix up internal architecture with observable behavior. Defense is the internal intrapsychic mechanism we infer, like isolation of affect. Resistance is the actual clinical behavior we see with our own eyes, like the patient speaking in a flat, robotic monotone. Now, resistance can be entirely conscious, like a patient deliberately deciding to withhold a secret, or it can be totally unconscious, like conveniently forgetting an appointment time. And we also need to remember primary versus secondary gain. Primary gain is all about managing internal psychic anxiety, whereas secondary gain is about securing some external advantage, like getting out of your daily responsibilities.
All right, that brings us to our fourth pillar, which is incredibly powerful and often pretty perplexing: repetition and reenactment.
You really have to ask, why on earth do patients repeat such destructive patterns over and over? By definition, repetition compulsion is the unconscious reenactment of past trauma. It originates from early traumatic relational attachments. But here's the intrapsychic mechanism. It is an attempt at active mastery over a trauma that was originally experienced passively. Take an abused child who grows up and continuously seeks out abusive partners. They are unconsciously trying to gain control over a scenario where they were once totally helpless. The clinical implication is tough but vital. As the therapist, you have to survive this reenactment without retaliating. Because to the patient, a predictable, tormenting relationship actually feels way safer than the utter terror of a healthy, unknown attachment.
This really captures the tragic loop of a reenactment. The patient is basically meticulously recreating the exact thing they are most terrified of. They unconsciously expect rejection. The anxiety of waiting for that shoe to drop is so unbearable that they behave aggressively to provoke it. And if you, the therapist, cave into your countertransference and snap at them, boom, the cycle is complete. The feared reality is perfectly recreated and validated in their mind.
Okay, let's tie all of these intrapsychic mechanisms together. We're going to walk through a comprehensive clinical vignette to see exactly how this plays out in real time.
Let's trace this chronologically. We start in childhood with a borderline patient whose developmental origin involves an abusive parent and a victimized self. Fast forward to session 1. The patient sits down, and they already have the implicit expectation that you, the therapist, are eventually going to attack them. By session 5, this expectation has hardened into negative transference. They are super guarded, incredibly suspicious. By session 8, this erupts into clinical behavior. The anxiety is just too high, and they start screaming at you, accusing you of not giving a damn about them. Now, session 9, here comes your objective countertransference. You start feeling angry, defensive, maybe a bit incompetent. If you don't contain those feelings by session 10, you're going to step right into a reenactment. You'll retaliate, probably disguising it as setting firm clinical limits.
And this right here is the exact moment the therapy derails. The patient's internal script says, I am the helpless victim, and you are the cruel tormentor. Through the sheer force of projective identification, that script literally colonizes the therapist's mind. Your lived experience actually becomes punitive and angry. Without even realizing it, you have perfectly embodied their abusive internal object.
Ultimately, mastering psychodynamic formulation means accepting a hard truth. You, the clinician, are the most sophisticated diagnostic instrument in the room. You literally cannot avoid transference, and you cannot prevent countertransference. But if you can tolerate your own induced feelings without acting them out, you can use them as a flashlight to illuminate the darkest corners of the patient's internal world. So I'll leave you with this thought to mull over. If a patient's pathology is actively designed to blind you, how will you systematically use your own internal reactions to finally see them clearly?